It's an interesting thing in the world of like science and technology, which I don't know much about. But one thing I do know is that things seem to be getting better and better and more sophisticated and more complex. Generations seem to be improving. And we become, in terms of science and technology, more knowledgeable and more sophisticated. But then, what's interesting is that in the world of like Torah, we're all raised with a certain principle, which is true, which is something that's called Yeridas Hadoros, that the generations decrease in general spiritual talent and ability. And so this is a strange thing. Sort of, again, when you look at the outside world, the secular world, things are increasing. The generations build upon each other. And yet, in Yiddishkeit, there seems to be, again, this notion of generations decreasing. Not only is that a little bit jarring, just that there should be such a huge contrast, but it's philosophically problematic, because we know there's a concept of istakel baraiso bar alma, that the Torah is the blueprint from which the world is built. And so whenever you have such a huge conflict and a difference between what the world that we see in terms of the physical world and the spiritual world, that's always a problem. There shouldn't be such a huge conflict and contrast between the two. So why is it? So in other words, why is it that in the world of science and technology, generations increase in power and strength, and yet in spiritually speaking, there seems to be this phenomenon of Yeridas Hadoros without there being any increase? So the question is really: is there anything in Yiddishkeit about us getting better over the generations? Is there any truth to that? The truth is like this. In this week's parasha, we have an interesting concept. The Torah tells us, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim 17 shana. Right? That Yaakov lived in Egypt for 17 years. Now it's interesting. The Zohar Kodesh asked the following question: when it comes to the different sort of times in Yaakov's life, the Torah does not go out of its way to give us the different times in terms of how many years. Like for example, everyone knows, like, it's a famous thing that Yaakov spent 14 years in Beis Medrash Shem Ve'ever before he went to Lavan's house. Torah doesn't say that. We figure it out using calculations. So ask the Zohar, we could figure out using calculations that Yaakov spent the last 17 years in Egypt. We could figure that out. We could know, we know how old Yaakov was when he died. We know how old Yosef was when he sold. We could figure it out. So what does the Torah tell us? What's being told us? What's the message of Yaakov lived 17 years in Egypt? Says the Zohar Kodesh. What the Torah is telling us is not only that he lived 17 years in Egypt. What it's saying is that those were the best years of his life. In terms of the level of Kedusha, the level of attachment to God that Yaakov ever experienced, the final years in Egypt were the greatest of his life. That's Vayechi Yaakov. Those were the years of his greatest living. So our Tzaddik points out, or Tzaddik says, well, that's an interesting phenomenon, because if we were to guess which years of Yaakov would be the greatest in terms of holiness, we would probably assume Eretz Yisrael,
or 14 years
or Shem Ve'ever, right? Those are pretty good years. But no, it's specifically the last years of his life when he's in Egypt. That's when he gets to the height of his greatness. Says Tzaddik, what that is telling us, and what that is establishing, is that although there is this idea of Yeridas Hadoros, that as generations go on, as time moves on, spiritual power decreases. I mean, you don't have to go too far than like opening a Gemara, you know what I mean? Like, they're better at learning than we are. This is the way it is, right? So there is a decrease, but nevertheless, what is being established with Yaakov Avinu is that at the same time, there is, as Rav Tzaddik puts it, the Nekuda Shebelev, the purity of the heart. There is some point in the Jewish soul that actually increases in strength as time goes on. In other words, there are these two currents. On the one hand, there's a decrease that takes place, but at the same time, there's actually an increase in spiritual strength. How do we explain that? So the truth is, if you think about it, there has to be an increase. There has to be some growth from generation to generation. Why? Because we know that the nature of holiness is that it's accumulative. You are, when the way Hashem made the world is the following. Like, we're only experiencing the moment right now, right? We're not necessarily aware and able to tap into the past, right? You can't take a time machine and go back in time. It doesn't work like that, right? All you have is the moment that you're in right now. But the truth is, you're also a sum total of all your previous experiences, right? So, in other words, explains Rav Tzaddik, is that Yuridas Hadoros, the descent of the generations, is a phenomenon which is rooted in the fact that all you experience is the moment that you're in right now. And as time goes on, every moment by itself, it decreases and it becomes worse and worse. But at the same time, in the deeper sort of recesses of the soul, there is an accumulation. There is an accumulation. Every generation is building on the accomplishments of the past, spiritually speaking. So at the same time, this is the funny paradox, that at the same time there's a decrease that goes on, but yet also at the same time, there is, on a more spiritual, deeper level, there is an accumulation of greatness that is happening over the generations. That's what Tzaddik says. Okay, but how do we make sense of that? Like, sort of, how does that accumulation manifest itself? How does it manifest itself? In what way are we greater than our ancestors? That's the question. That's the question. In what way? So there's a letter from Rav Kook. This is mamish a game-changing letter. You've heard of Rav Kook, Rav Yussie Zakutinsky. He was ahead of his time in terms of kiruv and Jewish outreach. He was very much involved in the early 1900s, in those years before the state, where there was a lot of conflict in Israel at the time, Palestine at the time. You had like the old yeshuv, you have the old settlement of like real Haredi, old school, and then you had a lot of these kibbutzniks, like these newcomers who were mostly coming from yeshivas and coming from places, but for the most part, most of them threw away their Yiddishkeit. They got swept up in communism, socialism, secular Zionism, all sorts of isms, and there was a huge conflict and stress between those two camps. And Rav Kook was a personality who was very much involved in outreach and trying to be makarv and trying to go to the kibbutzes and to try to show love and to bring them back into the fold. And it caused them a lot of that was one of the issues politically with them, because many people felt that was not the right hashkafa, you should shun them, you should push them away. So there's a letter that someone wrote to Rav Kook. It's a personal letter, because this person was writing, he was a Rav in the north, some city in the north of Israel, and the letter was basically his own son was swept up in one of these movements, and the father was saying, I don't know what to do. Like, what should my reaction be with my son? Should I kick him out of the house? Should I disassociate myself? Should I what do I do? So Rav Kook wrote a letter. He said, I don't have a lot of time right now to explain my philosophy, but my approach is, and I'm telling you, you should not push him away. You should keep the relationship strong, only love, and eventually he'll come back. Okay. But a couple of weeks later, Rav Kook had more time, and he wrote a second letter. And this letter, he says, listen, I wrote you initially sort of my philosophy, but now I have more time to really explain where I'm coming from. And he says like this, and it's a phenomenal thing. He says, it is true that historically speaking, back in previous generations, when you had situations like this, God forbid, where someone was like, became converted to another religion or became an apikoros or whatever, the general approach was to excommunicate them, to cut them off. That was the usual mahalach. But said Rav Kook, the reason for that was because in earlier generations, the collective power of the Jewish people was not as strong as it is now. And again, Rav Kook quotes this concept from Rav Tzaddik, which is that even though there's a decrease, you read the Sadaros, but on a deeper level, there is also an accumulation over the generations that we're actually becoming more powerful as time goes on. How does that manifest? So listen to what he says. This is a translation into English. There is, however, a tangible effect of this inner light. In other words, on the outside, we seem to be getting worse. But yet on the inside, we're building on previous accomplishments. And we're growing on the inside. And he says there is a tangible effect of this inner light. How so? In earlier generations, he writes, evil was able to grab hold of a Jewish soul and poison it with heresy. If a person, God forbid, was chapped by Yetzer Hara, it was almost impossible to get out of it. Almost impossible. To the extent that it was almost impossible to escape from its clutches. We were therefore commanded to stay away from heretics and not engage in them and to excommunicate them. That was the way it was. It wasn't because it was a good thing. It was because the poison, the issues ran too deep, and there's nothing we can do. This is not the case anymore, he writes. The power of the soul is greater, and even the evil of heresy can only dull the divine light of the soul. Says Rav Kook, the fact that over generations we're building on strength from strength, that we're increasing in inner light, you know what that does? said Rav Kook, that causes greater resiliency. We're able to bounce back more than we ever were able to before. And said Rav Kook, where in previous generations, once a person was like chapped by like apikarsis and things like that, very hard to get out of it. Very hard. But Rav Kook said, but nowadays, even though there's a decrease in the more of the external powers in terms of learning and davening and things like that, but the inner core, in terms of your resiliency and your ability to sort of start fresh and to pick yourself up and to just dust yourself off and to move on, you're greater than your ancestors, as Rav Kook said. And that's the accumulation of power that's been building up over the centuries. As we move on towards Mashiach, within the deeper part of who we are is building this reservoir of strength, and that expresses itself in resiliency. That's what Rav Kook said. And he says like this, therefore, we see that with people like this, as soon as one lights up for them the correct path towards Hashem with clear understanding and healthy emotions, the light of their soul begins to shine again. And Rav Kook says an amazing thing. If you want to bring them back, his approach to Kiruv were 2 points. Point number 1, you have to show them a holistic, healthy, big picture Yiddishkeit. And number 2, the presenter of such a Yiddishkeit has to be emotionally healthy. That's it. Once you present them a holistic picture of Yiddishkeit in an emotionally healthy way, it's 90% of the battle. You're done. Whereas in the earlier generations, because there was not this inner strength, so once a person was poisoned, like it was almost done. It was like fatal. But nowadays, the poison of apikarsis and Yetzars, it doesn't run that deep. It doesn't have the ability to penetrate your core. It certainly slows you down, and it certainly can give a person problems. But resiliency, we're much greater than we used to be, as Rav Kook said. And this is the paradox that's being laid out in our parsha. That Yaakov Avinu, on the one hand, it's the last years of his life, and he's in Egypt, but yet it's the greatest of all years. And that is establishing, again, we know Ma'aseh Avos and Labanan, whatever the ancestors went through, that is establishing for all time. We repeat those experiences. And what that's showing is this phenomenon, that although in terms of our general ability to learn and to daven and all that stuff, there's a decrease. But in the inner recesses of the soul, there's an accumulation of holiness over the centuries, and what that does for us is that it gives us resiliency. And it's a very, very powerful lesson. It's a very powerful lesson. And Rav Kook tells this father in particular, and because of that, what you have to do is believe in your son. You have to believe in the resiliency of your own son. And although it might take a while, it might take years, it might take a long time, but if you keep the relationship strong and try to go through this program of presenting a healthy Yiddishkeit in an emotionally healthy way, and you believe in the strength of your son, it's only a matter of time till he finds his way back. That's what it is. But therefore he says, but to push the son away, to do that, he says like this, we therefore must be confident that all the evil we see is only superficial. You have to be confident and you have to believe that the evil that you see in other Jews and in yourself is only superficial, while the inner dimension of the soul is holy and pure. I, therefore, Rav Kook writes, stand by my principles to bring close and not distance even those who have willingly distanced themselves. The person has pushed themselves away. It's not like, the person, he became a communist. I don't know, whatever it is, you know what I mean? He's willingly distanced himself. But he says, I stand by my principles to bring close even such people. This should be the prayers of all righteous Jews. Rav Kook writes in the letter, he said, all Shomer Emunah Yisrael, all from Jews should have this part of their davening, that all Jewish souls should be returned to their source in holiness, and the holiness within them it should be revealed. The joy that the return of these souls causes in heaven cannot be described. Cannot be described. When eventually these neshamas find their way back, and they tap into their own resiliency, and they bounce back, and they dust themselves off, and they turn the next chapter of their lives, the joy that it causes in heaven cannot be described. As darkness is transformed into light, there's no greater joy than that. And this is a chizuk for each and every one of us, not only for people that are in Kiruv, but every single one of us, you interact with Jews. You know what I mean? You interact with Jews, you interact with yourself, and a person has to be strong in their belief in their resiliency and the resiliency of the Jews around them, and to believe that all negative impurity and so on, it's purely superficial. It no longer has the ability of penetrating the essence of who a person is. In earlier generations, that might have been possible, but nowadays, for sure, it cannot penetrate that, because as you go deeper and deeper, what you'll find is an accumulation of centuries of holiness. That's what you'll find. That's what you'll find. So Rabban Hashem should help, that we should be able to, Hashem should open our eyes to be able to experience how Vayechi Yaakov, that these last few years before Mashiach, it will be shown that we're the strongest and most resilient and ultimately the holiest of all generations. All right. Sure. Thank you, Hashem.